Okay, good morning, folks. So we are now on day 41 of the semester, and we are transitioning into a new language. Within the first 40 days, we covered HTML and CSS and the tool Bootstrap. And so we learned to develop mobile responsive websites and images and videos and headings and headers and footers and sidebars and flexbox, and we learned arguably a lot already within 40 days. And so if you think about it this way, this class started 2 months ago. Just 2 months, how much information we've covered. It has been quite a lot. And we did cover it fast. And so more practice, I'm confident more practice is needed to master a lot of these topics. But if nothing else, it's your first and second exposure to these things. So this new language is called JavaScript. And I always like to talk about why something is important. I got a notepad here. Let me open up Word so I can just use Word instead of Notepad. And so I'll start this lecture off before just diving into JavaScript and how to code and blah, blah, blah. Just with a general, why is JavaScript important? Apparently I don't know my hotkeys to increase the font size. I thought it was Control Plus, but that's not doing it. Kind of one place, it's kind of fun to start. I don't know. A lot of beginners confuse JavaScript to be the same thing. Java. Is JavaScript the same thing? And my hotkeys are failing me. Is JavaScript the same thing as Java? And the answer is no. JavaScript is not the same thing as Java. So language-wise, if that's the first thing that I teach you about JavaScript, is that it's not Java. Those are two different things. All right, then you've learned something today. That's a good thing to know. And beginners often make that mistake. The beginner language is to confuse the two. And so if we learn that JavaScript is not Java, what does JavaScript do that Java really doesn't? Their differences are, there used to be, I would argue, more differences, and nowadays there's less and less differences, but they're just different languages. So that's the first thing. We are learning JavaScript. We are not learning Java. But why is JavaScript important? Well, I guess you would answer that by answering what do we do with JavaScript? And this is really kind of a broad answer here. But JavaScript can be used to solve problems. And so, examples of that. I'll give a simple example of that. A user lives in Illinois, and a company is shipping from Missouri. How much does shipping cost? Okay, that's a long way of saying we can use JavaScript to calculate the shipping and handling costs on a website. People live all around the world. Based on where they live, how much is it going to cost to ship something to somebody? Based on where they live and based on where you're shipping it from, based on the weight of the item, do some calculations. So I could even simplify that even more. JavaScript can calculate. JavaScript can calculate. Yeah, that's what it can do. It can do math. Simplify it even more. JavaScript can do math to solve real world problems. Think about all the real world problems in your math class. A train departs Kansas City traveling at this speed. It's going to St. Louis. It's carrying this much cargo. It weighs this much. Physics, all that stuff. It can solve problems. And so we can use math in JavaScript to solve problems. And in a web browser. So JavaScript runs in a web browser. Other applications don't. For example, Microsoft Word, there's a difference there. Microsoft Word is a desktop application. You have to install it on your computer. You don't have to install JavaScript on your computer. In fact, if you have a web browser, built into the web browser is called the JavaScript engine. And that JavaScript engine, much like your car's engine, runs JavaScript and takes the JavaScript that you write and performs the math, for example. Okay, so that's one thing that JavaScript can do. How else is JavaScript used? Now, when I say, by the way, in a web browser, what that means is JavaScript can be client-side code. Remember, we talked about server-side code versus client-side code. Server-side code is considered back-end code. Client-side code is considered front-end code. So client-side or front-end. That means that the math that gets done, it gets done by what? It gets done by the JavaScript engine that exists inside of your web browser. That means that your computer has to do the processing of that math to process and calculate the results. So when the work gets done on the laptop or on the desktop, on the client, that's considered front-end code. So JavaScript, much like HTML, much like CSS, JavaScript can be front-end. In fact, that's what we're studying here in this class. We are studying client-side JavaScript. What else can client-side JavaScript do? A lot of people in the first 40 days, now everything wants to be underlined by default. That's annoying. A lot of people in the first 40 days, they were working with Bootstrap, and Bootstrap has a carousel, and they were saying, man, I've just seen different image sliders. So we can use JavaScript for image sliders to really work with images and transition images onto the page. So image sliders, there's JavaScript image sliders and there's many of them out there, and we'll definitely go over some different image sliders in the class as part of what we learn. Transitions, effects on a web page. This is really common. Here's an example. You're on Netflix on your computer, and you hover over your favorite show, and what happens is, in the old days, what used to happen is a paragraph of text would pop up next to when you would hover the image, and all of a sudden content would show up on the page, and then you would hover off of the image and the content would go away. And so you can add content. Well, let's just do this one step at a time. Transition and effects, I need to talk about that before I talk about adding content. There's a lot of web pages that as you scroll, content essentially fades into the page. So it's kind of like a scrolling effect. As you scroll down, content fades onto the page. And so instead of the content just being there, it's kind of a fade in effect. Okay, so when I say effects, I'm talking about fade in effects, fade out effects. And that happens as you're scrolling. So that's the transition. You're scrolling, you're fading in, you're fading content out. Okay? But with that, you can also add content to a page. So let's just say you're on a page, and like I said, the whole Netflix example where you hover over an image like of your favorite movie, and all of a sudden a paragraph pops up with a description of that movie. Well, that paragraph wasn't there on the page visible until you hovered. So the user did something, the user caused, an event occurred, and that was a hover event. And then based on that hover event, new content, new HTML was added to a page. That HTML was not on the page until the user did something. So you can add content to a page, you can remove content from a page, so you can modify content that's on a page. So when I'm talking about content, obviously I'm talking about HTML. So if I rephrase that, I would say you could add HTML to a page with JavaScript. You can remove HTML with JavaScript. You can modify HTML with JavaScript. So it can completely flip what your page has on it. In that same context, you can add CSS. You can modify the CSS that's there on the page, and you can remove CSS. So you can completely change what your web page looks like and the content that it has on it. All of this that I'm talking about specifically is client-side JavaScript. This is all client-side JavaScript. Use my mouse. All of this is client-side JavaScript. There we go. How popular is JavaScript? Arguably, I feel like I got that wrong. Arguably the most popular language in existence. Proof. Don't just make that claim. How do you prove it? Every year, there's a giant survey that's done on a website called Stack Overflow. And if you look at this, is that the number? 65,000 developers took this survey. $65,000 people took this survey. Kind of read the highlights here. Python's kind of falling in popularity as far as loved, like languages that are loved. By the way, there's hundreds of languages that you could learn, right? We're learning 3 this semester. If I look at most popular technologies, this website has changed. Well, there you go. The most popular programming, scripting, and markup languages. Unsurprisingly, for the 8th year in a row, JavaScript has maintained its stronghold as the most commonly used programming language. So if we look at this list, the most commonly used languages are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I love this. This right here, this survey right here, proves that the stuff that you're learning is relevant. It makes me feel good. You will learn SQL. You will learn Java. You will learn C#. So in this top list, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the top 10 that are out there. In our 2-year curriculum. If you look at professional developers, JavaScript actually goes up from 67.7 to 69.7. I've heard it said before that if JavaScript were to go away, the World Wide Web would have to be rebuilt, like using different technology stack. Like it's that popular, it's that ingrained in everything that we do. JavaScript has been around since the early 90s, maybe before that. Let me do my JavaScript wiki. Let's see how long it's been around. It was created at Netscape in 93. The Mosaic web browser was in 93. In 94, it became the most used browser. So in 95, Netscape decided to add a scripting language. Which is where JavaScript came from. It kind of took its roots from Java because Java was super popular, and that's where the name came in. Java was a popular language, so they said, hey, let's name this scripting language based on Java because Java was so popular, and they named it JavaScript. Looks like LiveScript. Before it was called JavaScript, it was called LiveScript, and it came out in September of 95. And 3 months after LiveScript, they rebranded it as JavaScript just because, again, they hopped on the Java bandwagon. The choice of JavaScript name caused confusion, sometimes giving it the impression as a spin-off of Java. Since Java was a hot new programming language at the time, it has been characterized as a marketing ploy by Netscape to give its own new language clout, I'll call it. I don't even know how to pronounce that. Whatever. Okay. Not only is it kind of like the most popular programming language, in recent years, it has only gained popularity. Why? Why has it only gained popularity? Because of something called Node.js. Node is a software that you guys will learn in your third semester. So in your third semester, you guys will learn Node. And when Node came out, let's say 2009, according to this Wikipedia, Node increased the popularity of JavaScript, because what Node does is it creates a way to write JavaScript as server-side, or what is considered back-end code. So Node came out in 2009, and up until then, JavaScript was only client-side code, which meant this. It meant that JavaScript could be used to do these things, but that was it. Well, websites are more complex nowadays than what client-side JavaScript can do. If all you have is client-side JavaScript, what you don't have is e-commerce. What you don't have is what were considered Web 2.0 websites. Web 2.0 websites are things like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, anything where you can create a profile and in that profile interact, with other people, message other people, create your own page for people to post on, or message back and forth. So client-side JavaScript is really, because it's been out again since 95. So client-side JavaScript is kind of like, it's really important to learn for doing a lot of important things. But in order to do, again, e-commerce and Web 2.0 functions, you needed another technology other than JavaScript. And in the past, those other technologies were things like PHP. They were things like C#. They were things like Java, right? Java being different than JavaScript. And you could use these other languages for creating these more modern, functionally modern websites that have client logins, that have, again, all these. Basically, if it ties into a database, JavaScript couldn't do it. And to have user logins, to have shopping carts, to have tracking all this information at large scale, you need databases. JavaScript couldn't do that until 2009. When Node came out, now we can write JavaScript on the back end and interact with databases. And that was a big change. That was a big shift, right? And so because of Node, JavaScript is much more popular since 10 years ago, and has only been trending upwards in the ranks of popularity. Again, to be clear, this semester we're just learning the fundamentals of JavaScript, how to write JavaScript, and we're going to be focused on the client-side front-end code when we're doing that. Third semester, because a lot of you are in first semester right now, third semester, we will get into writing Node and writing back-end JavaScript and having logins and having shopping carts and things of that nature. So, again, I took this 25 minutes to talk about the importance of JavaScript, and I hope I hit that home, that essentially JavaScript is the most popular language that you could learn, arguably the most important language to learn. Like, if you're going to learn one language, I would argue learn JavaScript more than anything else. Now, a lot of what JavaScript does is interact with the HTML and the CSS, so it's not like I would only learn JavaScript. You got to know HTML and CSS so that JavaScript can work with it. But I would rank this as the most important language to learn. And back to that developer survey. Some people like to talk money. TypeScript, JavaScript. By the way, TypeScript is another server side. You have to know JavaScript to work with TypeScript. It is JavaScript. Here's one more thing. Why is client-side JavaScript so important? I didn't add this. Many other languages are JavaScript dependent. Languages. Many other languages are JavaScript dependent. Ajax. The J in Ajax stands for JavaScript. jQuery is based on JavaScript. TypeScript is based on JavaScript. The list really does go on. So in order to write something like TypeScript, you first must know JavaScript. You can see TypeScript extends JavaScript. So before you work with TypeScript, you must know JavaScript. So these are average global salaries. Let's look in just the United States. The United States pays a little bit more than globally. Average TypeScript developer, $120K. Average JavaScript developer, $112K. Guys, I don't know what it's like to make $112K. I've never made $112K. I don't make close to $112K. Okay? But I have been working at my job for a long time, and I earn a living wage. I earn a decent wage. And I could tell you, if I was earning $112K living in St. Louis, $112K in St. Louis would be like, because the cost of living is so low in St. Louis. I put it this way, right? Doctors that I know earn that kind of salary, right? So as someone who's learning something at associate level, and you're going to learn it very thoroughly is the goal, that with a few years of experience, you can earn these kinds of salaries that, doctors, pharmacists, dentists, you got to go to school for 6 to 8 years to earn these kinds of salaries in a lot of cases. By the way, we're also learning C#, $110K. Look at this. Did you know that? HTML and CSS, $110K. I bet you if I would have showed you this at the beginning of last semester and I said, look, if you really learn HTML and CSS that well on average in the United States, you earn 110K. I bet you I get a little bit more attention out of you guys when I'm lecturing. You guys might drink an extra cup of coffee for that one. 110K. That's that's pretty awesome. That's pretty awesome. So, you know, I in my mind, this industry is like no other. I don't know any other industry that pays these kinds of salaries without like an 8-year type of degree, you know, on average. So you guys are in a high-paying industry. If you are driven by the money, right? If you are driven by the money, and I think it's okay to be driven by the money. I honestly think that if more people were honest about it, more people would say they're driven by the money. I think that's a valid answer. You might pay a little bit closer attention over the next 40 days. Microsoft Word doesn't like JavaScript with a lowercase s. Okay. You can see here I've got my PowerPoint open, get starting with JavaScript. I'm going to try and do a fair amount of code with this. I'm going to give you guys a short 10-minute break. I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, so we are back from a short break, and going to get started with this PowerPoint, getting started with JavaScript. Yeah, this is just the foundations of JavaScript, and so I would just lump all of these objectives into, you know, JavaScript basics is really what all these objectives are all about. So when it comes to writing JavaScript, and I'll have my HTML over here. You can write it in a few places. One is external. And so if I say script source equals, and then my script.js. So this is an external link to writing to a JavaScript file. And if you recall, the link tag is how we link to external CSS file. Okay, so we got a script tag to link to our JavaScript versus the link tag where we link to our CSS. So, you know, if I were to go ahead and add a new file, and I think I called it myscript.js. Obviously, you got our nice little coding icon, and this is where we write JavaScript written here. Okay, now the first thing you'll notice is that a JavaScript comment is a single line comment done with 2 forward slashes. So we can write external JavaScript. Really, this is the best, you know, very much like external CSS is the best place for your CSS. External JavaScript is the best place for your JavaScript. And the reason is just like with CSS, you can reuse it with multiple pages. You can reuse it across many pages or even many websites. So external really is the best place, although sometimes it's just easier to write it in the file. So from a simplicity standpoint, it's a little bit easier just to write JavaScript in the HTML, which is what the next slide shows us. We can write, like if we get a heading, hello world, and this is obviously our HTML. The way that we write JavaScript is inside of a script tag. And so we have an opening script and a closing script, and this is how you write it, so to speak, embedded, almost like embedded CSS. We can have JavaScript embedded in our HTML, and you could have it in multiple places. So you could have it external, you could have it in the body, multiple times. Now, I will say one thing about this external JavaScript, as we'll find out, it's really best to put your external JavaScript at the bottom of the HTML body. Okay, and we'll talk about why that's important, but really that's considered the best practice, is putting the link instead of putting it in the head, which you totally can do. It can work that way, but if you remember back to Bootstrap, at the bottom of our Bootstrap template, we had our links to our JavaScript files. Okay, and there's reasoning behind that with performance and that kind of thing. As far as everything that's going on in here, this is all JavaScript. I wouldn't worry about slide 5 too much as far as that's a lot of code. I mean, that's quite a bit. We haven't talked about any of this yet, so don't freak out. We're going to talk about these different pieces in here, and we'll break it all down. So don't necessarily worry too much about what's going on inside of the script tags, as to say, okay, we can write JavaScript inside of a script tag, and that's really the only point here on slide 5. Again, so external and embedded JavaScript, those are the places we can write our JavaScript. Again, you can have script in multiple places, and maybe we can demonstrate a little bit of this. If I just do something quick, I'll now you'll notice one thing as I'm just coding this. In the code, they have the word var. I'm going to use the word let instead. Which is var is more old school, let is newer, and it comes with benefits. So every place that the book uses var means a variable, and what a variable is a place to store information. And so we're creating this variable here with the keyword let, even though var and let are interchangeable, just realizing that let is the newer approach. So we're storing this information in this identifier called today, and today is we code a date, and this is how we say, okay, this variable again is just a piece of data, and what this piece of data is a date. And what I'll do here is I'll say document.write today to date string. Okay, so all I did was I created a variable and I stored a piece of information in it, and I said to the document, which is when you see the document, it references the HTML document, basically this HTML file that we're in. Okay, in this HTML document, I want you to write the information that's stored in the variable in this kind of format. And the format is a date string. We'll talk about what a string is. Okay, and so if I open this with Live Server, you can see here that I get Tuesday, October 20th, 2020. It was able to read today's date. And then I've got my HTML heading. So we have our JavaScript and our HTML living together in unison. Now, there's no sort of formatting around this. You'll notice it just simply wrote, like if I inspect this, it just put it in quotes. It didn't put it in like a paragraph tag or anything like that, which we could do. We could put inside of our document.write, we could put a paragraph tag here or a H2 or something along those lines. So let me kind of, so that's your first little bit of a demonstration of writing JavaScript. Again, we're going to break this all down a little bit more, so I didn't want to It's not like you have to have this all memorized, for the test or anything like that right now, but just a basic line of JavaScript. One thing about people in general is they don't trust unknown sources. And there's a lot of unknown sources on the internet. There's a lot of sketchy websites. In a lot of ways, the internet and the World Wide Web, is the wild, wild west. Okay, it's still in its infancy. It's kind of been around for 30 years. So the internet and World Wide Web has been around for 30 years and popular for 30 years, but it's still in its infancy. And there's still a lot of challenges that we have to solve. And one of those challenges, probably the biggest challenge in my mind, is the trustworthiness of information on the World Wide Web, having more verifiable and factual sources of information. Point being is that you just, people in general don't trust in a lot of ways. And one of the things that you can do from a security standpoint, if you're a non-trusting person of the internet and you're just worried about your data and you're worried about your privacy and you're worried about hackers and everything of that nature, one piece of advice that might be given to you is to disable JavaScript. Right? Turn off JavaScript, because these hackers, they can write this JavaScript code and they can steal your credit card information. Which there's some truth to that. Right? Maybe not through JavaScript, but hackers can do that kind of stuff. And so disable your JavaScript. So all that just to say, some people, you could write these 2 lines of code, and some people that come to your website might not have JavaScript enabled because they don't trust the internet. It's kind of like disabling cookies. Well, if you disable cookies, then you pretty much can't use any website, but you're secure. So it's like, here's the fact. If you want to be secure, unplug everything, maybe even power down, but definitely unplug. If you unplug your internet, unplug your Wi-Fi, unplug your router, unplug your computer, unplug your cell phone, you'll be secure. You just won't have the access. Okay, back to this. Kind of like backwards compatibility is this no script tag. It's not even recognized, but it's interesting. And all this is to say, okay, well, if they have JavaScript disabled, we'll put this outside of our script tag. Then instead of doing this, we'll just give them the year 2017. And that's to say, okay, you write this JavaScript, but if JavaScript isn't enabled, then instead replace it with 2017. Okay, so that's a thing. That's a no script tag. That's more HTML than it is JavaScript, but you might have even seen this, please enable cookies to use this website. And so you can kind of say the same thing. Please enable JavaScript to use this website. And you could do that in a no script tag. All right. Again, we said that JavaScript can be used to solve problems. Well, in order for JavaScript to solve problems, we have to teach the computer, or teach the JavaScript engine, we have to get it to think like humans think. And a lot of ways that we solve problems as humans is we make what are called decision trees. It's like this. It's if my alarm clock goes off, then I wake up and go to work. So it's kind of like, if this occurs, then I do that. So if then statements. And in JavaScript, you could say, if this happens, do this. Otherwise, do that. Else if, do that. Else if, do that. And so what this is on this slide, on slide 11, is a bit of logic that is used to solve a problem. I left off on my what is JavaScript useful for form validation. If I'm just looking at this chunk of code, a lot of client-side validation is done with JavaScript. So form validation, you left your username blank. Your passwords don't match. Your passwords don't match. Please retype a password. You forgot to fill out your state. You got to tell me what state you're from. That's called data validation, and that's done with JavaScript. A couple rules of JavaScript. JavaScript is case sensitive. I promise you, as you are learning JavaScript, you will have your variable lowercased, and then when you go to use that variable, you might capitalize it. It's case sensitive. Notice all of a sudden, if your cases don't match, it doesn't work. So HTML and CSS can be somewhat forgiving. Okay, your page will show up. It'll show the content. It might not look how you want it to look, but it still shows up. And so HTML and CSS is actually much more forgiving. When JavaScript breaks, it's less forgiving. JavaScript breaks hard. HTML and CSS can break kind of easy. And what I mean by that is it still kind of works. JavaScript breaks hard. And what I mean by that is it doesn't work at all in a lot of cases. And if I inspect and I go to the console, notice the console tab, it actually gives me an error message right here. And it says, today is not defined. It even tells me the line number. So if I click on this, it'll show me, on line 14, I'm trying to write this variable today that's never been created. Well, it wasn't created because it was lowercase t on today. So it is case sensitive. JavaScript statements end with a semicolon. So here's our semicolon right here. It's equivalent to ending an English statement with a period. It's the end of the statement. In English, we end our statements with periods. In JavaScript, we end our statements with semicolons. Now, I just got done saying JavaScript breaks hard. Come to find out, in most cases it breaks hard, but if I take that semicolon off, it's actually forgiving enough to figure that out. So the semicolons, definitely put them in there. However, sometimes it doesn't cause a problem, but still, it's there for the readability of the code. And so if you imagine an English paragraph full of sentences without periods, it's very hard to read. And so just like that in JavaScript, you leave the semicolons off, it becomes harder to read. JavaScript ignores extra white space within statements. And so let's just put something like a couple tabs there and launch that. And it's like, okay, no big deal. We got some white space there. Here's our statement, but no big deal there. So that's a couple rules on JavaScript. Again, case sensitive. If I take this capital D to a lowercase d, even though that's still blue, I would anticipate that would break. Maybe that works. Yeah, it broke. So so when you're learning this, a lot of the case sensitivity, pay attention to that, because that'll definitely cause things to break. If you have this document.write, and you'll notice I could do things like today is and so I get today is, and I can even do things like put it in a heading like an H2 and then plus, and then I gotta close the H2. So I'm kind of wrapping the JavaScript inside of some HTML. And the HTML is inside of quotes. This is called a string. Anytime you've got opening, closing quotes like that, that's called a string literal is what it's called. And so now if I inspect this in the browser, as you might anticipate, our code is now inside of a heading. Right? So we're merging the two languages, our HTML and our JavaScript. And point that I'm getting at is that you might end up with a really long statement, and then so this I made line 14 longer. And so you can break up your statements by after the plus, you can kind of put a line break there. Okay, and so you break up this statement across multiple lines, which is all that they're talking about here. And it should still work. Okay, and you'll notice I left the plus over here at the end. I could bring that down there. And it still works. Okay, so the plus can go on either the end of one line or the beginning of the next, but it has to be there. So when do you split a statement is what this is talking about. Well, split a statement after you do some math, or after a plus symbol. So here was my plus. I kind of left this at the end. So after a plus symbol, I broke this off onto another line. So a couple places on where to break up statements. Now, rules for creating identifiers. First off, what is an identifier? Well, an identifier in this case is our variable. Like that's the only identifier that we have so far. But an identifier is something in the code that you get to give a name. And so you get to call this whatever you want. You could call it, cheeseburger if you want to, but cheeseburger is not a good identifier in this case because of what does this information store. So you want to give an identifier a good descriptive name for the data that it stores. Since the data that this stores is today's date, I could call this today's date. Okay, that might be a slightly better identifier. Okay, notice there's no spaces here. Okay, so no space. In fact, I try and avoid it. Like what they call this is camel casing, where you start with lowercase and then every new word is capitalized. So this is called camel casing for identifiers. And identifiers are just things that you get to give names, such as variables. So rules for creating, right now we'll just say your variables, okay? So, because that's really the only identifiers that we know at this point, okay? But there are some other kinds of identifiers besides our variables. It can only contain letters, numbers, an underscore, or the $sign. So those are the valid symbols. They cannot start with a number. So I couldn't say, 1 today's date. And in fact, well, there you go. An identifier cannot immediately follow a number, literal. So it's actually smart enough to figure that out in Visual Studio. Again, identifiers are case sensitive. We already learned that. No other special characters like this caret. Look at the valid letters, numbers, underscore, and a $sign. So underscore and the $sign are the only special characters. There is a list of what are considered reserved words that you can't name it. Like for example, let. Let is a reserved word, so you cannot name your identifier after a reserved word. And again, we haven't learned properties or methods, but there are some, again, these are just words that are kind of reserved. And so there's a list, and we'll go over that list. So here's some examples of valid variables. They give subtotal, index underscore, $sign is actually a valid identifier, tax rate, calculate underscore click, $log. These are all valid identifiers. And then there's camel casing versus underscore notation. This underscore notation, personally, I like camel casing a little bit better, just because I find the underscore, I don't know, it's just not an easy keystroke. It's not a terrible keystroke, but it's not as easy as just continuing to type with a capital letter. So personally, I like camel casing. When it comes to your identifier, one of the most important things is use meaningful names. Cheeseburger is not a good identifier unless that's actually what is stored inside, what that data is meant to represent. What is that data supposed to represent? A user's age, a user's name, a location, a date, and the big thing to learn here is to be consistent with your identifiers. Whether it's camel casing or underscore notation, it's just important to be consistent with both. Man, I've been talking a lot today. I got a sore throat. Excuse me for a drink. I got this giant pineapple mug as a gift. It was a gift that had a fruit bouquet. You know what I'm talking about? Edible fruit like pineapples and strawberries. And anyways, it's a giant mug. So I've been enjoying this. I'm drinking too much coffee. I like the mug. We kind of already looked at JavaScript comments, and that's what this slide is how to write JavaScript comments. The purpose for comments is for other developers to look at. Let's give that a little laugh there. Or no, we'll do there we go. The JavaScript engine inside of the browser just ignores comments. So it's not there for anything to run, just very similar to your HTML comments. It's not there for running code. It's there to document your code. Okay, and it's there to explain not only to other people, but to yourself why you wrote the code the way you wrote it. Because here's the reality. When you solve a problem, and if it's a complex problem, and then let's say you solve this complex problem, you wrote 50 lines of JavaScript or 100 lines of JavaScript, and then you go home that night and you fall asleep and you don't look at that code for 6 months, and then you come back across that code because you find one of your end users finds a bug. It's like an obscure bug, and you got to fix it now. And you come back to your own code that you wrote, but you come back to it 6 months later. Do you think you're going to remember why you wrote the code that way? Or how you problem solved that complex problem? Odds are you're not going to remember. So as much as it is documentation for other developers, it's important to comment your code to help yourself out, the future self of you looking at your own code to try and remember why you wrote the code the way you wrote it. Okay, and so single line comments versus multi-line comments. Multi-line comments are written like this. And sometimes just for decoration, people will put like extra stars to like get your attention. Like the extra stars aren't needed, but they'll do stuff like this just to really grab, like it's an important comment, you need to read this. Right? None of those extra stars are necessary, but don't use comments unnecessarily. So really don't do this. Do as I say, not as I do. So terms, statement is anything is a line of JavaScript that is ended with a semicolon. White space is ignored inside of your statements. Identifiers are things in the code that you get to give a name to. Okay, and the example so far is variables. Variables are one kind of identifiers, but you get to name them. That's why they're called identifiers. I once remember kind of like an internet joke. It's cheesy, and I'm not gonna get it right, but something to the extent of, I have a hard time naming my variables. How am I supposed to name a human? Like as in, you have a baby, you can't name your variables in your code. How am I supposed to give this living thing, a name? Okay. Like I said, I'm bad at telling jokes. I'm not a comedian. Camel casing. That's the syntax for our variables, where we start with lowercase and then every new word is capital letter. Comment, we got single line comments and multi-line comments. And commenting out. Sometimes you're writing some code and you're like, this code's not working. Let's just comment out this couple lines of code to see if that's the couple lines that are causing a problem. So comments are used for documentation. Commenting out code can be used for troubleshooting. Okay, so you also use commenting for troubleshooting, and like you got 1,000 lines of code. Let's comment out, 50 lines at a time to see if we can figure out where the problem might be. So commenting can also be used in troubleshooting. Okay. So in JavaScript, the JavaScript engine recognizes 3 kinds of data. And so when you have a data type, that is a kind of data. It is a category of data. So you could call it a data category, but I don't like that better. I like data type. It is a type of data. And so right now all of our data is stored in variables. And so these are 3 different variables that store 3 different types of data. Okay. The first data type is number. The second data type, and a number is just like 123. It can be decimal point, whatever. Okay, is a string. A string can hold any character that you can type. So it could be I don't even know what this guy. I've heard of this rapper before called 21 Savage. I don't even know any of his music, any of his rap. Suffice to say, that's a string. You could say 21 years old. You could say, you could put someone's name in there like I did. So you could put special characters. You could put ampersand, space, star, space. All these are just characters that I type, individual characters that I can type at the keyboard. You put them inside of quotes, and it can be double quotes or it could be single quotes. The point being is that they should match. You can't start with the single quote and end with the double quote. If you start with the single, you end with the single. Okay, single quotes versus double quotes. Either one, these are both. This is considered string data. All right, and there's really no limit to how much string data you could put. I mean, it could be a full paragraph or whatever. There's also Boolean, and Boolean holds true or false. You've probably maybe you've heard of Boolean, maybe you haven't, doesn't matter, but Boolean is a data type that those are the values that it stores. It stores true or false. So data types are defined by the data. And JavaScript is smart enough to say, okay, well, this is a number, so this variable is a number data type. Inside here we have a string, so this variable is a string data type. And this is a Boolean value, so this is a Boolean variable. So that's all handled. That's all handled by the JavaScript engine. In other words, the JavaScript engine handles the data typing for you. Okay, you don't have to specify that this is a string or specify that it's Boolean or specify that it's a number. It's just smart enough to figure it out. Again, these are all valid number types. And you got scientific notation or X notation. You could write this in JavaScript. They call it E notation. And so you take something to the -9th power. E -9 would be a really small decimal number. Now, a more specific, so this is called a number data type, but when you have a decimal, more specifically when you have a decimal, they call this a floating point number. What is I mean, that's a synonym, right? A decimal is a floating point number. It's just another name, just another word for a number that has decimals. Okay, so that's a term that is important and that we're going to see quite a bit, so I kind of remember that. Floating point numbers just means that it can have decimal places. If you try and put some huge number that's too large or really too small, you get this error, which is basically it's going to call it infinity or negative infinity. If it's too big, it's infinity, negative infinity if it's too small. So if you do happen to come, you're probably not going to come across that, at least in this class, right? But it is something to recognize that if I just put this ginormous number, I don't know what that range is. Okay, so I just typed a bunch of things there. So let's come down into here. And even though this is in different script tags, let me do a document.write. Actually, yeah, document. See if we can get this thing to say infinity. Man, I typed a really big number and it still didn't have a problem. That is incredible. Aren't you glad that you came to lecture today to watch me do this? There it is. All right. That's a long number. Another thing that we have to consider is an empty string. I mean, I don't know. I was impressed. That was pretty lengthy. Again, you know, if that's the only thing you learn, let empty string equals empty quotes. Okay, now this is something that you can code against. You actually see this more often. But it is, an empty string is still something. You know, no data is something. So you can test against that. You know, in other words, in your JavaScript, you could say, if empty string is empty, do something. Or if the username is empty, error message. Right? So if username double equals empty, give them an error message. Boolean values can be true or false. You could consider that like an on or off switch. True would be considered on or yes. False would be considered no or off. And it's also used in conditional statements. You could say if valid age is true, welcome the user to the site that sells beer. Right? Else, redirect the user to somewhere else. I was trying to think of like a kid game online. Isn't there like a penguin game where little kids play? Penguin. You guys, someone in this class played this penguin game growing up? I'm sure you did. Club Penguin. There you go. Redirect the user to Club Penguin. People are typing. I don't know. My little sister played it when she was growing up. As I've done here, you can declare your variables and give them a value on the same line, or you could say let data equals, you could do it on 2 lines, right? So 1 line or 2, those are both valid. You know, here's 1 line. 1 line to declare, which is to create the variable, is to say that you're creating it and give it a value. Well, giving it a value and assign. So when you see the word declare, well, declaring is this part right here. Line 23 is declaring. Okay, and what declaring it does is it creates the variable. Okay, and then this is assigning, which is to say that it's the equal sign, which is also called the assignment operator, right? Assigning a variable, which means you give it a value. You give your variable a value with the assignment operator. You can do it on 2 lines, or you can condense it down into 1. You know, the question becomes, why not just do it in 1? Well, if you can do it in 1 line, do it in 1 line. But sometimes you might not know what's going to go into the variable. In other words, you might have to ask the user what's their name, and you get that from a text box in the HTML. And so you read their username from the text box, and then you assign it into a variable. And so, you know, other operations might need to occur first before assignment. Okay, so if you can do it in 1 line, then that's fine. Do it in 1 line, but sometimes other operations have to occur that make you need to write it in multiple lines. And here's just a bunch of examples of kind of what we've already done. And you could even get real fancy with it if you want to, and declare. This is an example of declaring multiple variables and assigning all on 1 line. Declares and assigns values to 2 different variables. So they're getting real fancy here by separating it with a comma. All right, terms, variable. Variable is just a JavaScript, I call it a container. It's just a container that you can store data in. Okay? And really what it is a location in your computer's RAM. And so if you're familiar with your computer hardware, RAM is kind of like where programs run. Programs run out of RAM. And so bigger programs take up more RAM because they have more variables. More variables, more RAM utilization. And so really big programs, you know, take up more RAM by having a lot of variables. I mean, in a big program, probably hundreds or, you know, maybe thousands, I don't know, of variables. Okay, and it's not a problem. Don't worry. I always worried about creating too many variables because, again, I understood that the more variables you have, you know, each variable is a storage location in RAM. It like assigns this location of RAM. And so I thought, boy, if I have more variables, then that's going to use more RAM. And while that's true, I mean, it's such a small, teeny, insignificant amount of storage that while you're learning, the first step is to just learn JavaScript. Don't worry necessarily about taking up too much RAM at this point. All right, it does become important. You do need to learn to be efficient, but the first step is to walk and then you run kind of thing. We're learning to walk right now. Declaring a variable is just where you have the identifier preceded by the keyword let. Again, we're going to use the keyword let in this class instead of what the book uses as var. Let is a newer version of var. The assignment is where you have the equal sign. A literal value is something like line 17. It's something that's kind of hard-coded into the program. So this variable name is going to have a value of this string every time this program runs. And so that's what a literal is. A literal is like something that's coded into the program. It's literally going to be that every single time. This happens to be a string literal, and this right here is a numeric literal. It's just hard coded in. And the difference between a literal value, the other side of the coin besides a literal value, would be like getting user input from like a text box on a web page. Okay, so you can store literal values in variables, or you can get user input to store in your variables. Literal values are the values that are coded in. So a lot of terminology here, a lot of terms. Okay, let's take another 10-minute break. I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, so we're back recording. I'm going to kind of typed a lot of things here, so I'm going to kind of clean all this up. Kind of go back to some basics here. So slide 28 basically says that all these math operators that we're familiar with, we can use in JavaScript. So there's a little alert box that you can do. So we can do math, and you get this nice little pop-up that says, hey, the value is 3. So we can do math, we could do subtraction, we could do multiplication, division. You can do modulus, which is the remainder. So, you know, if you do 5 divided by 2, you get 2 with a remainder of 1, right? So that's normal division, but if we change this to a modulus, if we do 5 modulus 2, again, that just stores the remainder. In other words, that stores the value of 1 because 1 was the remainder. So that's what modulus is. Modulus is just the remainder. And then you've got these increment and decrement operators. And so if we were to say plus plus sum, we know that sum holds the value of 1, but then, you know, we can simply, anytime we need to, and we do wind up doing that quite a bit, is incrementing and decrementing, right? So we just incremented that by 1. And you wind up using this quite a bit, this increment and decrement operators, just again, to say to go up by 1 or to go down by 1. Order of operations is the same thing that you learned in your math class. PEMDAS, I believe. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. And then the increment and decrement take precedence over all of them, meaning we can do some sort of 8 times 9 right, we're going to get 72, and then if we say plus plus 8, that's going to happen first. And so actually, that's why I said I was trying that out, and I don't, let's do this. Let's do this. There we go. 9 times 9. Yeah, I was trying to do plus plus on just a solid number. You had to do plus plus on a variable instead. So that would occur first. The plus plus would happen first, and then it would do the multiplication. So, you know, 8 is num, and then you increment num to 9, and then you say 9 times 9, and that gives you 9 times 9 is 81, right? So that's your order of operations. That's all still the same. This is just a bunch of math examples showing you the order of operations, as well as, you know, all the normal output of your mathematical operations. As I kind of showed here in my code, that you can store a value and then use that variable in the math. And so even if I take out the plus plus, I can store 8 in a variable and then use that variable as part of the math. So the sum would be 72. Yeah, plus plus num says increment by 1. Increment by 1. Minus minus says decrement by 1. So again, we could just use numbers in our math, or we can use our variables in our math. You know, we might say user age, and then, you know, get the user's age from a text box, and then we would take days old, we'd make another variable called days old equals user age times 365. And this isn't going to work because user age doesn't have a value. So we'd have to finish this out. But that's an example of where you would take a variable and use it as part of your math, is all I was trying to demonstrate. Oh, here they take the perimeter of a rectangle is taking its width times 2 and its length times 2 and adding them together. And really, this is just all part of the problem solving. That's one of the things that I said, you know, that's a big reason why we use JavaScript, is to solve real-world problems. Real-world problems involves real-world math, and so math. So here's the thing, okay? Being good at math helps you be good at JavaScript. Okay, if you're good at math, it's a complementary skill. Okay, it complements your JavaScript well. Okay, so it helps. However, if you're not good at math, that doesn't mean you can't be good at JavaScript. You can still be good at JavaScript without being good at math. Okay, it just helps to be good at math. That's okay. If you're not good at it, it's okay. You can still be good at JavaScript. And to be honest, in this class, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, remainder, you know, we're not doing logarithmic, you know, calculus, you know, advanced, you know, we're not doing any sort of advanced math. I would say basic algebra type functions, nothing too advanced. Now, a new symbol that isn't in your math class, that is in JavaScript, are these: plus, minus, equals, plus equals, minus equals, times equals. There's also a divide equals that isn't on here, but let me demonstrate this. I don't even need the value 2. Let's just, we got value 1 is 10, value 3 is 30, value 3 plus equals value 1. Anyone got to guess what the output is? Take a guess, I don't care. Say 100. Someone guess something. Yeah, the first guess was correct. You take the current value of 3, which is 30, and you add value 1 to it. So this is considered a shorthand operation. Why it's considered a shorthand operation is because we would write this kind of long form. The long form of this is this: value 3 equals value 3 plus value 1. So line 19 here and line 21, they do the same thing, right? Line 19 says take the new value of value 3. The new value of value 3 is equal to the current value plus value 1. Okay, so that's the way that these work: plus equals, minus equals, times equals. So, you know, that's not something. This is not something you see in your math class. This is something that's very unique to programming. At least I haven't seen it anywhere else. You can kind of see here, counter is 1, counter equals counter plus 1 is the same thing as counter plus equals 1, which is the same thing as counter plus plus. These are just 3 different ways of taking a variable and increasing it by 1. Counter plus plus being the shortest notation, the shortest way of doing it. One thing that you might notice as you start doing math is that when you start having decimal numbers and you start doing math on those decimal numbers, that you oftentimes get like this trailing 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, which is often solved by rounding. Okay, so basically this is the way the computer does the math. The computer does the math to the best of its ability, but the computer gives you some data that really is not accurate. And so the way that we solve this is we round the 7495, we round it up to 750. And so just keep in mind that as you're doing some math, sometimes you need to kind of round to get the right results. So arithmetic expression, anything with multiplication, division, the operators are the plus, the minus, the divide. Order of precedence is, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. You're putting the plus, plus, and minus, minus on top of that. And compound assignment operators, that's this plus equals, minus equals, divides equals. Okay, you can also add together strings, and so that's what they do on this slide. They and I got to speed up, guys, a little bit. I'm going to start doing a little bit less code examples because there's like 60 slides, and I think I'm halfway through. So I speed this up just a little bit. Otherwise, it's going to take 4 hours. I don't think anyone wants this to be a 4-hour lecture. You can add strings together, and literally they just combine the strings. And so you could see when you add strings, another word they call that is concatenation. So it's just a programming word for adding strings together with the plus operator or the plus equals. So when you add numbers together, it does math. When you add strings together, they call it concatenation. And again, it's just literally the process of combining these two different strings into one string. I give a bunch of examples of that. You can take a string and a number variable and you add them together. And what happens when you add a string and a number together is it just combines them into a string. And so that's what this does. It adds strings and numbers together, and the result of that is a string. The result is not math. The result is a concatenated string. When you have strings, you can put in these escape sequences that cause the output to do certain things. So if I do, back over here in my code, let's this string value equals bills, whatever, pennies. So that just formats it on a new line. That's just an escape character that formats a string and breaks it across multiple, backslash ends like a line break. And then you could say backslash apostrophe. That's how you get an apostrophe in there. So that'll say Evans with an apostrophe S. And the question becomes, doesn't that work? That does work, but what might happen is that single apostrophe might conflict with, if you were doing a single quote like this, then all of a sudden that doesn't work, because that would be viewed as the ending of the string, and instead now it's not. Now that single quote would be the ending of the string. So that's why you need the backslash, double quote, backslash, single quote, so that they don't interfere with the ending of character of your starting string character. So concatenation join strings, concatenation operators is like plus equals on a string expression, and escape sequences. A string expression is something like this that has escape sequences, or actually, I'm sorry, a string expression might have a plus in it, and then like a variable. Let another value equals 1, 2, 3, and you say another value. So you take a variable and you add it into a string. You concatenate the variable into a string. That's a string expression, because you got multiple pieces that you're adding together. And you see what actually happens there is that those two values run together because there's no space. And so that's something else to consider, is that here you got an ending quote, and then you add in another value, which is a variable. So if you want that to space out, you need to add that space in at the end of the first string. Would be one way of doing it. That way they're not running together. I already displayed an alert. Now, typically, you don't need to say window.alert, but this is alert is a method. A method is just a behavior. It causes something to happen. And the alert method belongs to what's called the window object. And that's essentially, if you remember the document, that's referred to as the document object. That's your HTML document. The window then is the browser window. So anytime you see window dot, this alert is essentially part of the browser. So this little prompt comes, it's code in the browser that causes this alert to pop up. But in addition to alert, there's also a window.prompt. And so if we look at prompt, this is how we could get a little bit of user feedback. Okay. Now, that doesn't really do anything because, if the user's 12 years old, you have to then take that information and store it in a variable. And so one thing here, anything that belongs to window, that's referred to as the global object. Since window is a global object, you actually don't have to code window.prompt. You can simply say prompt, and the window is assumed. It's window.prompt. To then store what the user types inside of a variable, you declare the variable and assign it equal to whatever they type at the prompt. So this is actually, if you guys are dozing off, falling asleep, this is actually really good stuff right here. You need to wake up. This is really useful. You say, okay, 123 still doesn't do anything, but maybe let's make this useful. So let's put it inside of just kind of show you H3 ID. We're going to get the element by ID. The ID is top heading. So we're going to go into the HTML, get the top heading ID, enter HTML equals the user's age. So inside of the top heading, that's what enter HTML says. Inside of the HTML, basically in the tags, thank you for catching that. So we're going to prompt the user for their age, and then we're going to basically put that age inside of an H3. And I still had another mistake. Let me find that mistake. It says cannot set property inner HTML of null. And so I didn't see that. Oh, here's the problem. And I remember what I said about this is good. This is a good learning exercise. I'm glad I showed this. Putting your JavaScript at the bottom of the HTML file. Like, for example, let me just take this couple lines of code here. Now let's just keep it right here. I'm going to keep it right here. That's going to get rid of my error. At least that error. Okay, so there's 23 that now if I inspect 23, you could see it's literally the inner HTML, what they call that is a property. It puts the value inside of the tag. That's the inner HTML is what they call that. You can link your JavaScript in the head. It's better to link to it at the bottom. It's best practice. So why did moving my code from the top to the bottom work? Well, the HTML loads top to bottom. And so the heading needed to load in the browser window. It needed to load the heading to then put something in the heading. So line 19 put something inside of the heading called top ID. I couldn't put something in the heading before it was loaded in the browser window. So what I did was I let the HTML load first, and then I ran the JavaScript. And that's why you want to put your JavaScript at the bottom. Let the HTML load first, and then run the JavaScript. So Dylan, again, I think I'm answering your question twice, but I just want to make sure that I answer it. Yes, you can link to your JavaScript in the head, but it's better to link to it literally right before the closing body. That's the best place to link to it. So again, they're kind of showing. Now there's a difference here between. So there's some terms that I wanna mention again. A method such as the prompt. Prompt is a method, and methods always have parentheses. Boy, did I get that right? I think I might have. Methods always have parentheses. Okay, that's why when I look at prompt, i.e. prompt, and then you've got parentheses. Properties, okay, methods always have parentheses. Methods are behaviors. Okay, so they cause something to happen. They cause something to happen. Properties don't have parentheses, and they hold data. A property, i.e. inner HTML. Again, case sensitive. Inner HTML is case sensitive. Inner HTML is a property, and notice we just put something in it because it holds data, like very similar to a variable. Very similar to a variable. There are differences. I won't go into those now. Properties hold values, so we just assign them some sort of value. And in this case, we're assigning it the value of the user's age. Okay, so I just wanted to cover some terminology. Methods are behaviors, and they have parentheses. Properties don't have parentheses, and they hold data. Like, for example, window.location is a property that holds the URL of the current page. So just out of fun, let's see what happens if I do prompt window.location. How old are you? 11. And then here it prompts me with the URL, which is localhost lecture.html. So it's the full URL of that web page. I should have done an alert, not a prompt. Prompt is asking for information. Alert just displays something. Okay, so here's just a bunch of examples, and again, I've kind of already given examples. Of like getting user input. Let me do this. Here's something that you will need at a very early point of this class. Okay, and they introduced this method. Again, we talked about what a method is, called parse float and parse int. So let me demonstrate that. Let me demonstrate this parse float and parse int. So if I do, let me first show a problem and then show how to solve it with these methods. I'll do let value1 equals prompt enter a number. Let value2 equals prompt enter another number. Let sum equals value1 plus value2 alert the sum. So here's a problem. If I say 2, enter another number 2, you would expect 4. We get the value of 22. Head scratcher. Pretty sure you might be able to get an idea of what's going on. Let's just say 4 and 5. You would expect 9. You're getting 45. So what happens, even though we're trying to do addition, is we're doing concatenation. Remember, concatenation is adding strings together. Well, when you have a window.prompt, the value that's returned, well, a user can type in whatever they want. When you prompt the user here, you could say enter a number, but they could type in their name. And notice it's just concatenating my name together. It's adding my name together, right? So if you want this to do addition, unfortunately, the JavaScript engine isn't smart enough to know, hey, you know, you're trying to do addition here. So you have to give it a little help. And you have to say, okay, yeah, this could be a string, but we're expecting this to be a number. So you need to do this method called parse int. Parse int if you're expecting a whole number. Parse float if you're expecting a decimal. So I'd even do that here. Parse float. And so what that's going to do is it's going to take whatever the user types and put it into a number format that can store decimals. And then when this has been converted to a float, so parse is kind of like, I think of it as convert. So this means convert whatever the user types and convert it into a float so that you can do math instead of doing concatenation. And if I run this, now if I say 4 and 5, we're actually getting addition instead of concatenation. And so that's parse float versus parse int, and that's how those can be used. Again, sometimes when you're getting input from the user, if they can type in anything they want, that's going to be a string format. So you have to convert the data types. Okay, we went over the write and write line methods, so not going to hit too much time on that. A lot of terms that we covered. The window object is the global object because you don't have to type it. If you say window.alert, you could just say alert because it's considered the global object. What goes inside of a method, like here, this is called a parameter. Inside, if you provide a value to a method, that's considered what goes to the method, the data that you're sending there. That's called a parameter. When you type a method in this nature, you're calling this method. So we're calling the prompt method. So that's some language. A lot of terms in this JavaScript. That's why it's so important that this chapter, you read this chapter, you study the slides, you watch the lecture, because we hit these terms here, and then we use them starting next chapter. You know, so it's easy to be overwhelmed if you don't put in some time in this early. Oh, okay, good. So there's a slide here. The next 10 slides are really just demonstration. And if you take a look here, it's calculating miles per gallon. So, you know, how many miles did you drive? How many gallons of gas did you use? And give the user the miles per gallon. Okay, kind of the same thing here. Prompt the user for 3 test scores and then give the user the average. Okay, and they give you the HTML and they give you some of the CSS. And then there's an exercise to modify the miles per gallon application. And then start with the miles per gallon app and change it to the new app. So, your homework. Okay, and this is going to be the end of the lecture. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here.